Good evening and welcome to the January New Perspectives in Military History. I'm Ronald Spector. I'm the Johnson Professor of Military History here at MHI this year, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Arthur Bergeron, Jr., who is here at the member of the staff here at the U.S. Army Military History Institute. Dr. Bergeron received his PhD in American History from Louisiana State University, where he studied under the late Professor T. Harry Williams, who many of you have probably heard of, a great Civil War historian, and Dr. Bergeron has carried on the tradition. He is the author or co-author or editor of nearly a dozen books, including Civil War Reminiscences of Major Silas T. Grissamore, Confederate Mobile, which is actually about Alabama, and Guide to Louisiana Confederate Military Units. And his latest books deal with the Civil War in Louisiana. Part A deals with military activity, Part B, the home front. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bergeron, who is going to talk to us tonight on the subject of From Engineer Lieutenant to Corps Commander, the Civil War Career of Godfrey Weitzel.
Thank you, Ron. How many of you here tonight are familiar with the phrase, like Grant took Richmond? How many of you are old enough to remember that? A few of you. It used to be a part of our language, but if you analyze the situation, you will realize that Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant was never in the city of Richmond in any sort of military capacity. Richmond was, in fact, captured by a 29-year-old Major General by the name of Godfrey Weitzel. Although he was a Corps commander at this time, he had begun the Civil War with the rank of Lieutenant of Engineers. Very few people who are interested in the American Civil War have ever heard of Weitzel, and the few who have heard of him really don't know much about him. What I'd like to do tonight is give you a general overview of Weitzel's Civil War career and try to sum up, to some extent, what kind of man he was and analyze how I believe he performed as a general. Godfrey Weitzel was born in Winslin, Bavaria on November the 1st, 1835, the son of Ludwig and Susanna Krummel-Weitzel. Ludwig was a tailor, and he moved with his family to Cincinnati, Ohio, when Godfrey was only about 2 years old, to allow him later on to enter the United States Military Academy. His father and mother claimed that he had actually been born in the United States. He attended all of the public schools. All of his public school career was there in Cincinnati, graduating from high school. Then Representative David Disney was able to get an appointment for Godfrey to the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1851. There, his classmates included future Union Generals William B. Hazen, David McMurtry Gregg. He was nicknamed Dutch by his comrades there because of his German background. He graduated second in the class of 34 in 1855, and his high academic standard resulted in a commission as a brevet second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. Very shortly afterward, he is promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. This is 1856. And he is promoted to first lieutenant in 1860. During this interim, in 1855, Weitzel receives orders to go to New Orleans, Louisiana. He reports in November of that year to Brevet Major Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, who was in charge of the engineering operations of that city, and Beauregard assigned Weitzel as his assistant in the construction and repair of the various fortifications around the Crescent City. He would remain on this assignment until August of 1859. It's unclear to me at this point in my research on Weitzel exactly how the association between he and Beauregard was during those years, but it appears that they became friends during this interim, particularly because of a letter that Weitzel wrote to Beauregard in February of 1861. At this point, Beauregard had received appointment to be superintendent at West Point, but because of his Southern connection, this appointment was rescinded. And Weitzel writes him a letter of condolence. He said he regretted the quote-unquote rude treatment that he had received from the United States Army and hoped that it would not cause Beauregard to resign and leave the Army. One portion of the letter, I believe, indicates what Weitzel felt about the crisis that threatened the Union at this time. He said, "Can't we devise some means to kill off all these politicians? This will restore peace and harmony to our country." Very typical of the professional army at the time, a great disdain for things political. He eventually, as I said, receives orders to leave New Orleans and to report to the military academy as acting assistant professor of civil and military engineering. Prior to actually going on this assignment, he goes back to Cincinnati briefly, and on September the 3rd, 1859, marries Louisa C. Moore. Her father, Augustus Moore, was a Mexican War veteran, and during the Civil War would become a brevet brigadier general in the Union Army. Within a short time of their arrival at West Point, Louisa was badly burned when her dress caught fire, and she died of her injuries within a day or two. Weitzel naturally was granted a leave of absence from December of 1859 until August 1860. One of his close friends from West Point, Cyrus Comstock, the famous Civil War diarist, wrote that he had expected Weitzel to return to Europe to visit some of his family there. He may have done so. There are some indications that he simply went and stayed with his wife's family there in Cincinnati during this interim. In January of 1861, Weitzel was ordered to report to the commander of Company A of the Corps of Engineers, and he went with that unit to Washington, D.C. On March the 4th, 1861, the company served as a part of Abraham Lincoln's escort during his inauguration as President of the United States. The following month, the company received orders to go to Pensacola, Florida, as part of an expedition that was to go and prevent Fort Pickens there at Pensacola from falling into Confederate hands. It said that while he was stationed at Pickens, Weitzel on several occasions sneaked across the bay and went behind Confederate lines on various reconnaissance missions, trying to determine the strength and position of the Confederate forces. He leaves Fort Pickens in September of 1861, returns briefly to West Point. His next assignment came in October when he was ordered to report to Brigadier General Armsby M. Mitchell in Cincinnati. There he became chief engineer of the newly formed Department of Ohio. His duties there in Cincinnati included construction of fortifications to protect that city and recruiting for Company D of the Corps of Engineers. In December, Weitzel was given command of a company of sappers and miners in Washington, D.C. While in this position, he assists with building a number of pontoon bridges and trains that would be used by the Army of the Potomac in its campaigns against Richmond. Weitzel's reputation, I believe, at this early point in the war, was on the rise. People recognized that he was a very talented engineer officer and thought that he would do well in that capacity. In February of 1862, almost strictly because of his familiarity with the New Orleans defenses, Weitzel became chief engineer on the staff of Major General Benjamin F. Butler. The latter, as you probably know, was putting together an expedition to assist the Navy in the capture of that important southern city. Flag Officer David G. Farragut had the primary responsibility for the attack and assumed what was known as the West Gulf Blockading Squadron. Farragut and Butler hoped to use Weitzel's knowledge of the forts around New Orleans, particularly Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip on either side of the Mississippi River south of New Orleans, in planning the attack. In March, Butler's army had reached Ship Island off the coast of Mississippi, which was also the rendezvous for Farragut's warships. According to Butler's memoirs, Weitzel was asked at this point to meet with him and Farragut to discuss the possibility of a land assault against New Orleans. Butler wrote, quote, "Lieutenant Weitzel, while constructing the forts, had been for 2 years in the habit of duck shooting all over those swamps and knew every bay and bayou of them. The young engineer is said to have informed the general and the flag officer that it would be difficult but not impossible to land troops in the rear of the Confederate forts, particularly Fort St. Philip, which was on the east bank of the Mississippi River, and approach it from the rear. However, at the end of this conference, a decision was made to bombard the forts with mortar boats, which were a part of Farragut's squadron and were commanded by Captain David D. Porter. Porter had assured Farragut and Butler that with these mortar vessels he could reduce these 2 brick forts to ruins and force the surrender of their garrisons without any appreciable, if any, Union bloodshed. Weitzel voiced great doubt that this would be the case. He had absolutely no faith that these mortar boats would succeed in achieving this result. And from this point onward, in fact, through the rest of the war, he and Porter never got along because Weitzel didn't hesitate to criticize Porter's ideas. Weitzel's prediction proved true. Porter conducted this bombardment for several days. While his guns succeeded in driving the Confederates away from their cannons briefly, they did not destroy the forts and really did not a great deal of damage to them. And Farragut ultimately decided that he would take his squadron and steam past the forts at night. This would cut the Confederates in those 2 forts off from resupply from New Orleans and would allow him then to go with the majority of his squadron right on up to New Orleans and hopefully capture it quickly. Again, Butler and Farragut consulted Weitzel about how this naval attack should be conducted. He had been observing the fire of the Confederate artillery as they infrequently responded to the mortar bombardment. He reported that he noticed that all of the gunners had been firing their pieces at a high elevation to reach these Union ships which were downriver from them. And he said that he thought that the Confederates were lazy enough that they would leave their cannon in those positions overnight rather than depressing the barrels back down. So he advised that if the fleet would go by as close as it could to the 2 forts, that the Confederate guns would be actually firing over them before they had a chance to lower their fire and actually hit any of the vessels. He also strongly suggested that the Union cannoneers on these vessels fire as much canister and grape at the Confederate forts as they possibly could to drive the Confederate soldiers away from the cannon and reduce the amount of cannon fire that they might be returning. Farragut followed Weitzel's advice. The Union vessels, as you undoubtedly know, successfully passed the 2 forts and destroyed the small Confederate naval force that was behind them between it and New Orleans and proceeded on towards New Orleans, where the city ultimately did fall into Union hands. As Farragut's squadron is sailing up towards New Orleans, Weitzel does go back and assist some of General Butler's men in transferring from Ship Island to a point behind Fort St. Philip. They disembarked there, cutting off the Confederates from resupply, and within a few days, the 2 Confederate garrisons in those forts surrendered. New Orleans essentially fell to Union forces without a fight, and Butler's main army moved up to occupy it on May the 1st, 1862. Afterwards, the general had high praise for Weitzel's role in this campaign. He wrote, "Both in the formation of the plan and in its execution, the local knowledge and preeminent skill of Lieutenant Weitzel were of the utmost value. Few men contributed more to the reduction of the city than he." Butler appointed Weitzel as assistant military commander and acting mayor of New Orleans. Once the army had occupied that city, this was his reward for his good work in the campaign. His duties included the recruitment and organization of troops in the city, and he succeeded in helping to raise 2 infantry regiments and 4 cavalry companies in New Orleans. Now, many of the officers and most of the men for these regiments came from the New England units that had been a part of Butler's army, but literally thousands of New Orleanians joined the Union Army and became parts of these regiments. I believe that Weitzel's ethnic background was very important, highly responsible for the enlistment of hundreds, if not thousands, of first and second generation Germans who lived in the city. Following a Confederate attack on the town of Baton Rouge in early August 1862, Butler sent Weitzel to the former state capital to study and report on the situation that he found there. An officer who was on board the steamer with Weitzel going from New Orleans to Baton Rouge wrote that his fellow passenger, quote, "was a man worthy to command an army." At Baton Rouge, Weitzel laid out a series of earthwork fortifications that would protect the barracks and arsenal there at Baton Rouge. And although Union forces would evacuate Baton Rouge in late August of 1862, They would return in December of that year, and they would use these fortifications that Weitzel had laid out as the basis for the defense of Baton Rouge for the remainder of the war. Butler is very impressed with Weitzel, and he succeeds in obtaining a promotion to the rank of Brigadier General for the engineer captain on August the 29th, 1862, and he assigns him to command what was known as the Reserve Brigade of the Department of the Gulf, which was the command that Butler held. This brigade consisted of Connecticut, New York, New Hampshire units, numbered about 3,000 men, roughly, when Weitzel took command. A captain in one of the Connecticut regiments described the new brigadier as being about 6 feet 4 inches tall, fairly tall for a man of the Civil War era, and described him, quote, as a man of attractive and imposing presence. And this is something that a number of his contemporaries, men who served under him, remarked about Weitzel during the course of the war. After about 2 months of training, Weitzel took his Raw Brigade on a very successful campaign along Bayou Lafourche, which is one of the many streams that run through South Louisiana on the west bank of the Mississippi River west of New Orleans. He succeeded in defeating the Confederate force that was located along Bayou Lafourche and drove it back to a point where it would no longer be a threat to New Orleans, which was his main objective in this campaign. Some historians who have studied Weitzel's campaign along the Bayou Lafourche have called it a precursor for William Tecumseh Sherman's famous March to the Sea in Carolinas campaign in 1864 and 65. That's because Weitzel and his men virtually destroyed the sugar industry along both sides of Bayou Lafourche during their little raid. They burned mills, barns, equipment, and it was literally not until a number of years after the Civil War was over that the sugarcane industry in this part of Louisiana finally began to recover. Weitzel was not at all reluctant to have his men do some confiscating to improve their situation in camp. A Connecticut officer wrote, "We have a very generous and wise general, and he is willing that what is actually necessary to make his men and officers properly comfortable should be taken, and in the proper manner. But he will certainly punish the perpetrators of outrage." So he was allowing his men destruction, but he was being concerned enough about it that they were going after military targets rather than doing anything really to hurt the civilian populace. During this campaign, hundreds, if not thousands, of runaway slaves came into Union lines at the end of the campaign. Weitzel writes back to Butler in New Orleans complaining that he had twice as many blacks around one of his camps as he had soldiers, and he told Butler that he really didn't know what to do with all these refugees. He said that he couldn't feed them, and that as a consequence they had had to find food for themselves. He reported that many of the white citizens of the community who had already taken the oath of allegiance had come to him and begged that they be allowed to retain their weapons because they were afraid of outrages by these runaway slaves. Weitzel also objected in messages back to Butler to the assignment of 2 regiments of Louisiana Native Guards to his command. Now, these were regiments that had been raised by Butler in New Orleans and consisted of African-American soldiers. Weitzel, I believe at this point, was opposed to the idea of blacks serving as soldiers. In one message he wrote, "The commanding general knows well my private opinions on this subject. I have no confidence in the organization. I will gladly go anywhere with my own brigade that you see fit to order me. I beg you, therefore, to keep the Negro Brigade directly under your own command or place someone over both mine and it." Now, ultimately, Butler was able to persuade Weitzel to accept these 2 regiments under his command, and in some of his writing after the war, Butler claimed that the brigadier quickly lost whatever prejudices he had had against black soldiers. In December of 1862, Major General Nathaniel P. Banks replaced Butler as commander of the Department of the Gulf with his headquarters in New Orleans. Now, because Weitzel had been a protege of Butler's, Banks would have preferred to have gotten rid of him, but the situation really would not allow him to do that. For one thing, Weitzel was a very competent engineer officer, an accomplished engineer officer, a graduate of West Point, and he had done fairly well in a department that really lacked good leaders. It was woefully short of talent, according to some. For another thing, Weitzel's men really admired him and vowed that they would follow him anywhere into battle. And Banks really needed that sort of dedication to the generals who were going to be serving under him. so he retains Weitzel rather than trying to get rid of him. Weitzel would lead his brigade in several campaigns in South Louisiana under Banks, and ultimately would be given command of an infantry division under Banks in the 19th Corps during the siege of Port Hudson in the summer of 1863. When the Union Army moves against the Confederate earthworks at Port Hudson, unlike most of Banks's generals, Weitzel went forward with his men when they made their attacks, rather than remaining way to the rear where they couldn't see what was going on. Particularly during the initial assault on the Confederate earthworks on May the 27th, 1863, Weitzel seemed to be everywhere, encouraging his men to go forward against the Confederate defenses. Prior to this attack, he had urged very strongly that Banks coordinate his attacks against the Confederates that day, and he said, if you will do so, we'll go right over the earthworks. It wouldn't even be a battle. But Banks, being a political general, failed to make the proper plans, failed to coordinate his attacks, and they all met defeat separately as they went against the Confederates that day. Union forces would make several other assaults against the Confederate earthworks there at Port Hudson during the subsequent campaign. But during all of this, Weitzel remained with his men, and his men's confidence in him continued to grow. It's said that the sight of him simply gave courage to anybody who saw him. He was so highly esteemed by his command, and such was their confidence in him, that whenever he was present, his men said that they feared neither danger nor failure. On several occasions, Weitzel would go through the camps that these men had back behind their lines, and he would rail and complain about this political General Banks, who was sending all these men to be killed and wounded for no good reason. And this further endeared him to his men. They had no confidence in Banks themselves, and this just made them feel stronger about their general. One of his officers recalled after the war that he gave a little pep talk from time to time to some of his troops. On one occasion, he mentioned he talked about Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, and he compared his soldiers to them, saying that they symbolized all that was good about the Union. He told them simply that if Boone and Crockett had still been alive, they would be in the Union Army. They would be fighting for the same cause. Weitzel didn't know at the time that Davy Crockett's son, Robert H. Crockett, and a direct descendant of Daniel Boone, Captain Daniel Boone, were serving the Confederate Army at Port Hudson while he was uttering these words. Port Hudson eventually does surrender. The Confederate garrison there capitulates on July the 9th, 1863. Weitzel takes a brief leave from his division for a few weeks, but he exercises it again during several campaigns in the fall of 1863 in South Louisiana. Some of the Louisiana civilians with whom he came in contact during these campaigns had very few good things to say about Weitzel. If you're familiar at all with the Civil War, you may have heard of such things as the French-American Claims Commission, the United States Claims Commission. These were commissions that were set up where people who claimed to have been loyal to the Union could come and essentially sue the United States government for damages that they had suffered at the hands of Union soldiers. And there's a fair amount of testimony from these Louisiana civilians about the Union Army and their depredations in South Louisiana, and Weitzel figures prominently in a number of these cases. He was by some referred to as a crude-mannered, foul-tempered, arrogant, lascivious, and flamboyant officer. Now, although Weitzel, as I said, had lived in Louisiana for several years prior to the war, he appears to have constantly exhibited a very low regard for most of the people of that state. He considered these civilians as, quote, bitter and uncompromising enemies of the United States. And during many of his operations, Weitzel commandeered the very finest of the plantation homes in the area to use as his personal headquarters. He would simply throw the families out, sack the premises, and in some instances, when he and his men left, leave only ashes behind them. That October, during one of these campaigns, Weitzel took over one particularly nice plantation while some of the Union troops were supervising the removal of some obstructions that the Confederates had placed in a nearby bayou. After the war, in one of these claims cases, the family who had owned this home complained very strongly about Weitzel's conduct while he had been in their house. The owner described Weitzel's behavior as bordering on the perverse. He said, generally intoxicated, he exhibited himself openly and shamelessly in fond dalliance with Negro servant girls. Now, to the white planters of the day, you couldn't get any lower than that. The planters' daughters said were so outdone by his coarse manners and language and indecent behavior that they not only refused to go down and play the piano for he and his staff, but they remained hiding in seclusion in their rooms up in the attic portion of the house during the entire time that he was using it as his headquarters. When the 19th Corps finally took up its line of march and left the area, the family claimed, quote, "The heavy drinking young general rode into the yard, called out to his staff, 'Come on, boys, there are other rich plantations here to sack.'" And the family is probably lucky that he didn't destroy their home when he and his men left. Another incident during this same campaign, I believe, indicates that Weitzel had a flair for the dramatic and a sense of humor. Union engineers were constructing a series of pontoon bridges over a bayou to replace the bridges that had been there before and had been destroyed by the Confederates. By the time these pontoon bridges are complete, someone has to go and inspect the work, prove it before the troops can cross. And because of his standing as a well-known engineer officer, Weitzel was picked for this task. Witnesses recall that he, quote, "walked briskly to the center of the bridge where he joined the chief engineer who had supervised the construction. With a pride here and a kick there, much as a prospective buyer would inspect a used wagon, Weitzel nodded his approval. After one giant jump in the middle, which was lustily hurrahed by his men, the general drew his sword and charged with drawn saber as though attacking some invisible opponent on the other shore." You can imagine what this sort of thing does to the men's morale who are serving under him. They really looked up to him for things like this. Weitzel continued to lead his division until December of 1863. At this time, he left South Louisiana and returned to Cincinnati on recruiting duty. Many of the men in the Army of the Gulf, the Department of the Gulf, were disappointed that he was departing. Major General William B. Franklin, who was commander of the 19th Corps, under whom Weitzel had served during this entire period, wrote a letter to his wife and said that as a division commander, Weitzel, quote, "was as good as anyone has." One of Weitzel's staff officers described Weitzel's departure in these words. He said, "Only those who have served under our beloved general can realize the great loss he is to us. Our camp for the last few days has been compared to a New Orleans graveyard where the dead are entombed in little houses." There was a great deal of disappointment that Weitzel was going to be leaving. His men had grown to love him so much. Weitzel does return to New Orleans briefly in March of 1864, but he doesn't stay long. He apparently asked to be relieved of duty with the Department of the Gulf. My personal feeling at this point, and I can't bear this out from the research that I've done so far, is that he simply no longer wanted to serve under Nathaniel P. Banks. He'd seen incompetence enough and wanted to go to another theater. He soon received orders to report to his old protege, General Butler, at Fort Monroe, Virginia. There, his patron gave him command of the 2nd Division of the 18th Corps, which was a part of Butler's Army of the James. Butler, as some of you know, was one of those generals who was going to be taking part in Grant's grand strategy for the spring of 1864. He would be one of the Army commanders who would be moving against several parts of the Confederacy simultaneously, trying to tie down Confederate troops so that they couldn't move around and reinforce each other. The Army of the James had as its mission to move from Fort Monroe up the Virginia Peninsula, threaten Richmond, threaten Petersburg, and hold Confederate forces in that area so that they couldn't reinforce Robert E. Lee in Northern Virginia. Begun in early May and known as the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, Butler's efforts started well but ended in failure. This was due in large part to the incompetence of his two corps commanders and their unwillingness to cooperate with each other during the Bermuda Hundred Campaign. Weitzel didn't particularly perform that great during the early days of the Bermuda Hundred Campaign. I would say he was probably only an adequate division commander at the time. But after the Army became bottled up, as the phrase goes, at Bermuda Hundred, Butler appointed Weitzel as the chief engineer for the Army. And he worked very hard to lay out and supervise the construction of various lines of defense that the Union soldiers would hold between the James and Appomattox rivers. In late May, General Montgomery Meigs and John G. Bernard came down from Washington, D.C. to inspect the Army of the James and the situation at Bermuda Hundred. They recommended very highly that Butler be removed from command. They didn't like the way he was running the Army at all. And they recommended that Weitzel be promoted to command of one of the two corps in Butler's Army. This promotion would come, but it would be several months before it actually happened. In the meantime, Weitzel performed duties that were perhaps more important than his work on the earthworks. He cooperated with engineers from General Grant's Army in the location and construction of a pontoon bridge across the James River that would allow the Army of the Potomac to move from its positions around Cold Harbor to the outskirts of Petersburg before General Robert E. Lee even knew that the Federals had left his front. Shortly afterwards, Weitzel found and lay a pontoon bridge a little bit farther up the river at a point called Deep Bottom. This bridge would allow the Army of the James to cross the James River, threaten Richmond from the southeast. This meant that the Confederates had to dedicate more men, strengthen their defenses in this position, and watch for the possibility of Union assault from that direction. Weitzel's bridge, one historian has written, quote, ensured that Grant's armies could exert pressure against both Petersburg and Richmond, preventing Lee from quickly shifting his forces from one flank to the other for offensive or defensive purposes. At the same time, the lodgment north of the James River increased Grant's tactical options and demonstrated the mobility of the Army of the James. Rather than actually being trapped at Bermuda Hundred, as many historians have written, the Army actually could virtually travel anywhere it wanted to because of these series of bridges whenever any opportunity beckoned. Weitzel is breveted as a Major General of Volunteers on August the 29th, 1864. The following month, he goes on a reconnaissance to the blockading fleet at the mouth of the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. He was expecting to be given command of a surprise expedition against Confederate Fort Fisher in succeeding weeks. This expedition was postponed, however. The Confederates had learned about it. There were not enough Union troops to carry out the expedition, so it was called off. Weitzel returns to Virginia on September the 29th, 1864, and receives command of the 18th Corps, Corps commander having been incapacitated the day before. The very next day, his men are responsible for repulsing a Confederate counterattack and preventing the Confederates from capturing Fort Harrison, which they themselves had just taken. Weitzel continued to lead the Corps during offensive operations north of the James River in late October of 1864. In all honesty, he did not perform all that well during this period of time. His men were supposed to have moved and outflanked the Confederates at one point, but his troops got lost because they had bad maps, they had very poor reconnaissance. They didn't get into position until the Confederates had actually sent reinforcements to the area. And unwisely and probably against the orders of Ulysses S. Grant, Weitzel ordered his men to attack the Confederate position. They were repulsed with fairly heavy losses. Nevertheless, he was promoted to full rank of Major General of Volunteers on November the 17th, 1864. In early December, the Army of the James is reorganized. It had been the 10th and 18th Corps, both of which contained white divisions and black divisions. An all-white 24th Corps was created, and an all-black 25th Corps was created. Weitzel received command of the all-black 25th Corps, the only major general in the Union Army to have this distinction during the American Civil War. Later in the month, he accompanied the first expedition against Fort Fisher down in North Carolina. He advised the commanders that they were probably not going to be successful in their attack. In particular, he was at odds with now Admiral David Porter, who again was assuring his superiors that by bombardment he could reduce Confederate defenses so that the Union troops could attack and overrun them quickly. After the bombardment had been completed, Weitzel went ashore, conducted a reconnaissance of the Confederate positions, and advised that they had received very little damage and that no assault should be carried out. The expedition ends up in failure, but Weitzel escapes any criticism for it. After he returns to Virginia, he receives leave of absence and goes back to Cincinnati. And on January the 12th, 1865, he marries a second time, marries a lady by the name of Louisa Bogan. The honeymoon was relatively short. He's back in Virginia by the end of January. His front remains relatively quiet for the next several months. Major General Edward O.C. Ord had succeeded Butler as commander of the Army of the James. He receives orders from General Grant to take about 2/3 of his army from the front there near Richmond down to Petersburg to relieve some of Grant's troops who are going to try to move around General Lee's right flank southwest of Petersburg and end the stalemate there. This leaves Weitzel in command of all Union forces north of the Appomattox and James Rivers. Grant issued orders to him to remain vigilant to what was going on in his front and if found at all practicable to attack and try to break through. He felt that a success north of the James should be followed up with great promptness. Weitzel, while he was in this situation, became convinced that the Confederates in front of him outnumbered him, and he felt that they would probably attack him once they realized that most of the Army of the James had withdrawn from the area and had gone to Petersburg. He became very nervous about it. An officer of the 13th New Hampshire Infantry recalled that as soon as Ord and his men had headed south, Weitzel, quote, was all up and down the lines and everywhere at once, seeming neither to eat, drink, or sleep, and acting like a man gone stark mad. His soldiers, some of them, felt that his behavior was such that they questioned whether or not he was fit to remain in command. One of the staff officers in one of the divisions wrote comparing Weitzel to an old woman alone in a house whose every creak conjures up intruders. Well, Grant's final assaults against the Confederate defenses at Petersburg occur on the morning of April the 2nd, 1865. And he sends word to Weitzel to be aware of what's going on his front, and if he sees an opportunity, he's to attack Richmond while Grant is attacking Petersburg. He doesn't want the Confederates to be able to shift men from the Richmond defenses to Petersburg to fight Grant. He finds no obvious weak spots in the Confederate entrenchments and never orders his men to go forward. Late in the day, he begins receiving word from Confederate deserters and captured Confederate soldiers that Richmond is going to be evacuated. If not, it is being evacuated at the time. He passes this news along to General Grant, who again advises him, if he sees an opportunity, to seize it and move with his forces against the city. Weitzel orders his men to remain vigilant. It said that at one point he had all of the regimental bands in his command up and beating their drums and blowing their horns all night, trying to keep the Confederates on edge. About 2 o'clock in the morning, his soldiers are awakened with an unearthly roar. The Confederates were in fact evacuating Richmond. They had lit a number of fires in the town. These fires spread to some government stores and eventually to some arsenals and ordnance depots, and there were a number of explosions, very loud explosions, as many of this ordnance began to blow up. Early on the morning of April the 3rd, 1865, Weitzel orders his men toward the city. He knows that the Confederates are gone. And this turns into something of a race to see which unit can be in the former Confederate capital first. Mayor Joseph Mayo of Richmond has been left by the Confederate forces to sort of fend for himself. He gets in a carriage about 6:30 in the morning. He's riding out looking for some Union general to whom he can surrender. Weitzel hears that Mayo is out there. He quickly saddles up at his headquarters, rides, meets Mayo. They negotiate for a while, and about 8:15 in the morning, they conclude their negotiations. Weitzel and his staff enter the former Confederate capital at Richmond. He quickly sent telegrams to Grant and the War Department back in Washington announcing his triumph. He visits the former Confederate capital briefly and then establishes his headquarters in the White House of the Confederacy. This is the house that Jefferson Davis had lived in while he was Confederate president. He orders his troops to do what they can to assist the civilian population in the city. In particular, he gets as many wagons as he can possibly get to bring food supplies into the city. Both the white and black populace was badly in need of food at the time. Weitzel will then act as host when Abraham Lincoln visits Richmond. Lincoln arrives there from City Point on the early afternoon of April the 4th, 1865, and drives and meets Weitzel at the Confederate White House. Weitzel serves then as Lincoln's aide as a guide as he drives through the city in a carriage, and the two of them inspect the damage that had been done by the fires. Before Lincoln is ready to depart, go back to City Point, Weitzel asks him very pointedly how he thinks Weitzel should treat the former Confederates in Richmond. And Lincoln replies to Weitzel, "If I were in your place, I'd let them up easy. Let them up easy." And the general followed the president's advice, much to the dismay of many Northerners who had expected the Southerners, particularly the Virginians, to receive very harsh treatment once the war had ended. On April the 12th, General Ord comes back to Richmond. He assumes command of all Union forces there. Probably because of his own dislike of black troops, Ord sends the 25th Corps from Richmond down to Petersburg. Weitzel writes to Butler shortly after this that the citizens of Richmond were largely to blame for his men being ordered away. He said, "You know that the Negroes had to leave. The smell was offensive to the FFVs," that's First Family Virginians. I believe it's possible to interpret in these words of Weitzel's an indication that he had not completely overcome his own prejudices concerning blacks. The 25th Corps remained in the vicinity of Petersburg until late May. At that point, they receive orders to go down to Texas, the Rio Grande River. Weitzel is to command the Rio Grande District and the Department of Texas ultimately. White troops, let me get a drink of water here. Both white troops and black troops had been sent to Mexico to try to encourage the French army, which had been occupying Mexico for several years, to cease and desist its support of the Confederates in Texas. Weitzel and his men will remain there several months. They were rather uneventful months for his men. He is finally mustered out of Union service on March the 1st, 1866, having been brevetted a Major General of Regulars for his gallant and meritorious services during the war. He returns to engineer service with the rank of captain once the war is over. He'd been a major general, now he's a captain again, something that happened to a lot of Union generals after the war was over. Eventually, he would receive promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He worked on a number of various engineering projects on the Ohio River, the Great Lakes. Some people who have studied this part of his career say that this was probably the highlight of Weitzel's career, that he accomplished as much as an engineer officer on some of these projects as he had as a general. One author in particular has said that Weitzel achieved, quote, a professional stature that ranks him with General George Goethals of Panama Canal fame. This is pretty high praise. Unfortunately, Weitzel, his health had begun to decline because he had been out in the field supervising these projects a lot. He is ultimately assigned to duty in Philadelphia to try to help recover his health, but he dies there of typhoid pneumonia on March the 19th, 1884. His body is returned to Cincinnati and is interred there in Spring Grove Cemetery. Now, ultimately, I would like to write a biography of Weitzel, the first biography that's ever been written of this general. And it's difficult at this stage of my research to say exactly how good a general he was. My inclination at this point is to rate him at least slightly above average. Clearly, he exhibited personal bravery. I don't think there's any doubt about that. As I said several times, he was not afraid to go out in front and lead his men into battle rather than staying behind them. Additionally, he always did what he could to take care of his men. I mentioned a couple of instances of this, whether they were in camp or out on field and campaign. He did what he could to take care of his soldiers. They respected him for this. They had great confidence in his leadership, as I've indicated. I see really no reason to doubt one conclusion, that he was probably one of the better engineers who commanded troops in the field during the American Civil War. As a brigade and division commander, I believe he was competent, resourceful, tactically skillful. He may have received Corps command before he was ready for it, but I don't think that this means he didn't deserve the promotion ultimately. His performance in that position was not really that outstanding, but then he had very limited opportunity to show what he might do as a Corps commander. But I believe he did have abilities, and he grew with increased responsibility as he received it during the course of the American Civil War. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. Appreciate you coming out. We have time for some questions. This would, excuse me, this would have to be a relatively tentative assessment, but I believe that the two got along fairly well. I don't think it was a case of Weitzel using Butler's influence to advance himself. While Butler doesn't have one of the greatest reputations of Civil War generals, certainly as an administrator, he did good work when he was in command at Baltimore, when he was at Fort Monroe, and in the city of New Orleans. He did what was necessary to control hostile populations, particularly in Baltimore and New Orleans. And while he wasn't a great general, he had great administrative abilities, and I believe Weitzel recognized that part of Butler's career. And probably there was some grudging admiration for what Butler was able to accomplish in a relatively difficult situation, particularly that he faced there in New Orleans, being surrounded by many more Southern civilians than he had under his Army command. And probably this friendship just survived, Butler's being reassigned, and was, I believe Weitzel was probably happy to be reassigned to Butler's command in the Army of the James in 1864. Yes, sir.
When Weitzel was made Corps Commander, do we have any feel for how many other people were of that caliber? A Corps Commander is fairly easy to come by.
Not that many. I mean, the 25th Corps, there were roughly 25 Corps in existence at the time. So you've got, in one part of the country at the time, about 25 other Corps commanders. There are actually more than that scattered through the entire Union Army at the time, but it's a relatively small number of men. So he's in sort of an elite status by the time he gets to be a major general and a Corps commander. Yes, sir.
Thomas Morris Chester of Harrisburg, the black Civil War correspondent for the Philadelphia Press, in his book writes quite a bit. He covered the 25th Corps and some of the troops going into Richmond. And he mentions that some of the white troops the black troops were initially told to stand aside.
Right.
The black troops go in first. But Chester's saying that the black troops double timed the men. So what is correct?
As I said, there was something of a race.
Yes.
And the black troops from the 25th Corps were doing their dead level best to get there first. But the evidence that I've read indicates that Weitzel issued orders for them to stop just on the outskirts of the city. And this is primarily because he didn't want to upset the white civilians in Richmond by having black troops take over the city. The 13th New Hampshire, a white unit, generally gets credit as being the first unit in, and there are a couple of other white brigades that go in shortly afterwards. So it's sort of after the initial shock of being captured has worn off that Weitzel then orders the remainder of his black troops into the city. And as best I can tell, that there were no problems between those soldiers and the Southern civilians.
The second part, in Harrisburg, we're planning after the Civil War, November the 14th, Pennsylvania had sort of a grand review for the USCT troops coming home. And we're going to erect a historic marker. Chester, who was the correspondent, was one of the persons involved. Butler, Cadieux, some of these other gentlemen to attend. We know the papers mentioned Cadieux attending, and I think Butler may have been there, but I'm not sure if Weitzel. Is there anyone
I've found no indication that Weitzel participated in that.
participated at that parade?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir.
At that stage of the war, in that particular corps of Weitzel's, what percentage of the company grade officers were black?
None.
None at all? But is there not some evidence that late in the war, there was some...
There were a few odd company and all company grade officers in the Union Army, but I don't know of any that were in Weitzel's 25th Corps.
If we could just add our most of the commissioned black officers in the Civil War were chaplains, or would have come out of the Louisiana militia that became
Right.
Louisiana Native Guards.
Those first 3 regiments of African Americans that Butler recruited in New Orleans, most of the company level officers in those first 3 regiments were African American. The field officers, the colonel, lieutenant colonel, major, staff, they were all white, but the company grade officers were black. Banks got rid of them. He began getting rid of them shortly after he assumed command of the Department of the Gulf, and by the summer of 1863, they were all gone. Banks wouldn't, while he sang the praises of the black troops who had fought in the battle at Port Hudson, didn't want black officers. And as I said, he got rid of all of them in the Department of the Gulf. Other questions? Yes, Dave.
Art, you mentioned his disdain for politics of the civilian kind, at least. A lot of senior Civil War Union leaders often had a political base, whether they acknowledged it or not. Some of the Ohio generals in particular. Did Weitzel have any political base back in Cincinnati as well?
Not to speak of, really. I mean, he had pretty much immersed himself in Army life, and I've detected no strong ties to any politician of any note back in Cincinnati. He had some friendship or some connection with the mayor of Cincinnati, and that's about as high as I've been able to detect so far. I think if he had had stronger political patronage, some of the promotion might have come easier, but I just don't see it. Yes, sir.
Did I understand that Weitzel was transferred to Philadelphia and finished his career there and then
Right.
died? What did he do there?
Most of what he did by the time he got to Philadelphia was desk work, paperwork. His health was so bad that he really couldn't get out in the field anymore. And eventually, as I said, he comes down with typhoid pneumonia and dies. During his career on the Ohio River, the Great Lakes, he had been out virtually every day whenever he could, supervising these various projects, and it just, he paid the toll for it later on. Yes, sir.
How about the papers? What have you got to work with? Was he much of a correspondent? Any bit of
Well, that's going to be the big problem with my research. He left no personal papers. At least I haven't found any. He had 2 daughters. He had no sons. His parents were dead by the time of the war. He had one brother who was in the Army with him. As I said, his first wife had died. He really had apparently no good friends with whom he was corresponding during the war. When he does remarry in January of 1865, his wife apparently goes with him to the front. He's not writing personal letters to anybody, so it's going to be difficult to get that personal side of Weitzel. I mean, the official papers are voluminous, and the National Archives is full of them. The Cincinnati Historical Society has a large number of official papers, both relating to his Civil War and post-Civil War career. But only a few letters scattered here and there. This letter that I mentioned, that I quoted from, where he writes to Beauregard, that's squirreled away in a little archives. They didn't even know to whom the letter was written. They knew it was a Godfrey Weitzel letter because he signed it. But they somehow or another didn't read the text of the letter and say, oh, okay, Superintendent of West Point, Beauregard, yes, that's who he's writing. I told them, and they were happy to get that information. But that's one of the few personal letters that I've come across so far. I suspect that there may be, and I haven't gotten into the Butler papers in any real depth yet. There may be some letters back and forth between the two of them after Butler leaves New Orleans. That kind of remains to be seen. I'll just have to, it'll be an official biography with whatever tidbits of personality I can find here and there. Yes, sir?
When he accompanied Lincoln in Richmond, it's mentioned that the 5th Massachusetts USCT troops accompanied him. Is this true, or?
There was a small number of troops that did go with them on the city. It wasn't like a large entourage. It was a relatively small party that accompanied the two men as they were riding in the carriage, but there definitely were some African-American soldiers that were present. Yes?
Let's talk a little historical politics. Why is it that, we've never heard of Weitzel? I mean, he's and to some extent, people like Ward, Army of the James people, I mean, that part of the Union effort around Richmond tends to be so forgotten compared to the broader perspective of the Army of the Potomac and Grant and some others. Is there kind of a, in the way histories get written, the way things are perceived after the war, is there an obvious bias towards the Army of the Potomac? Do they seem to control the information flow? Is there a reason why the people from the Army of the James tend to be forgotten?
I think there's a certain amount of that, but that's because the Army of the Potomac's doing most of the fighting. I mean, once the Bermuda 100 campaign is over, and with the exception of the book that Dr. Summers has written about Richmond Redeemed, the Army of the James doesn't get involved in a great deal of fighting. It's pretty much holding the lines there at Bermuda 100 and on the north side of the James. It's a stagnant front. And it's a lot more interesting to write about Grant sending his men against Hatcher's Run or the Boyden Plank Road or Five Forks, places like that. That's where the action is. So these guys, to a large extent, do get overlooked.
And if you'll allow me, even though my supervisor says that my book is eminently forgettable, to the extent that the personalities of the wartime figures are involved, they can carry over into the post-war period. Butler and William F. Smith were very much in Grant's Black Book, although they hated each other. Both of them hated Grant, and he came to hate both of them by the post-war period. Ord, on the other hand, is very much a Grant man, but he's a Grant man much less than being an Army of the James man. So to the extent that the post-war writing after any conflict reflects the great generals, be they Eisenhower or MacArthur or Schwarzkopf or whomsoever, in this case Grant, the forces with whom he more directly served, and you would have Sherman out in the West, are more likely to predominate in the historiography, which makes all the more interesting what you're doing in broadening our knowledge and opening up new areas and reminding us that there's more to the Civil War than just Grant and Sherman and Sheridan in the Federal High Command.
I found it odd. I obviously got interested in Weitzel when I was working in Louisiana. I was the first historian at the Port Hudson State Historic Site down there, and that's where I got to know who Weitzel was. And as I began studying him, okay, he gets to be a major general, he gets to be a corps commander at the end of the war, he commands the only all-black corps in the Union Army. Nobody's ever written anything about him. I mean, there is literally, other than entries in several Civil War encyclopedias, there's not even a journal article that I've been able to find about this man. I think he deserves better than that.
Okay, was one other question in the back, I think? We got one more? Yeah, right here.
In his report, I know there's very little written, what was his comments, if any, as far as the black troops which fought under his command at Port Hudson?
The black troops didn't fight under him at Port Hudson. They were in another division, somewhat close to where his division was fighting. He certainly was aware of what they were doing, but really didn't because they weren't under his command, he wasn't reporting on their action. I haven't found anything that he said, you know, about what they did during the attack on May 27th. It's something that remains to be seen if I can find any comments that he had about them.
Okay, I want to thank Dr. Bergeron for a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Just stand by a second. I've got to give you your word. Okay. I think we all learned a lot tonight. Actually, when we scheduled this, I didn't realize how much it was going to tie in with Black History Month, but it really had a lot more connections here than I realized. For those of you who are active duty officers, we had any 29-year-old Corps commanders out there? General Nelson. I mean, it's quite a standard to hold up to there, I think. I'd like to present Art with our standard memorable memento of presentation, a copy of the very fine poster announcing his presentation, something he can remember it by, though I think we'll all take a lot more away from this than just a poster. Thank you very much, Art.
Thank you very much.